Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm sure some people will continue to join us as we go, but thank you for being here today, everyone. I'm Jen Slattery with the League of Cities and Towns, and today we are joined by our colleagues from Obvio AI, and I'm excited to hear all about the traffic study and the products that you have. Thank you to Seth Webb and Zara. Zara, I should have asked you how to pronounce your last name.
All good. Safula, nice to be here.
Sufila, thank you for joining us. And of course, Drew is the CEO of Obvious, so we're gonna let Drew kick it off. Thanks for being here, everyone.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Drew, and one of the co-founders of a company called Obvio that does the program called Let's Drive Safer, focused on traffic safety. It might be hard to get everybody to introduce themselves on this call, but it would be helpful if, as people join, they can chime in on the chat, maybe share their name, share some of the things that they think about in their role, and what I'll do is I'll share my screen and we can walk through some slides, but this is meant to be very conversational. Please feel free to stop me if you have questions, whether, just by interrupting or I think sometimes people can use a hand raise on the Zoom as well.
Yep.
Um, but just quickly, we'll talk about what Avio is, some of the traffic safety work that we've done, and specifically a driver behavior study that we did in Rhode Island. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in other states and why we're interested in potentially partnering. Um, just a quick background on myself and the company. Me and my other co-founder have been working on traffic safety for years. We used to be at this company called Motive that built this camera dash cam that you would put on trucks, and you'd put it in front of the truck driver, and it would scan the world for skipping stop signs and speeding and red lights, and it would give real-time feedback to that truck driver. And over the course of a few years, we deployed this on close to 200,000 vehicles and saw a 25% reduction in crashes. And after we did that, we realized, hey, that there's something powerful about this technology. We're actually able to make a difference. What if we brought this to the world of public safety? And that's sort of how Avio was born. And in terms of some of the technology, we've built an AI camera that can detect all these different kinds of behaviors. And one of the places that we really started and pioneered was stop sign monitoring cameras. A lot of people here are probably familiar with speed cameras and red light cameras. But one of the complaints that we have heard continuously from residents in all parts of the country is people are just blowing through stop signs. And interestingly enough, our company got our start by helping pass one of the first legislations across the country for stop sign enforcement, which basically allows people to use these cameras to monitor stop signs the same way they do speed and red light. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but these cameras have been deployed partly primarily in Maryland to start, but now we're sort of deploying in Colorado soon. And everywhere we deployed these cameras, we saw 65% on average reduction in unsafe driving. And some places we've seen an 80% reduction in unsafe driving. And so we sort of realized, hey, this is really working. And over the course of the last couple of years, there's been a lot of momentum across the country. People in Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Delaware, all have been pushing legislation that mirrors what we passed in Maryland, and of course Rhode Island as well. You guys probably have heard this left and right. It's a really hard problem to solve traffic safety. There are so many different kinds of behaviors that drivers are doing. People are distracted, and frankly, officers just can't be everywhere all at once. And so, in the past, it's been hard, particularly because cameras are also limited to speed and red light. And so, we wanted to build a device that could detect all these different kinds of behaviors, particularly around pedestrian risk, to figure out how we can solve that. Now, one of the things that we do with our technology, and we've done this in a few different states now, is actually go to specific locations and figure out, how bad is the behavior really? You hear about people complaining, a lot of it's anecdotal, And so what we did is we actually took our technology. We have sort of a portable tripod version of this, um, and um, walked around to 23 different locations across Rhode Island. 13 of them were stop sign controlled, 10 of them were crosswalk, primarily in Providence and Pawtucket. And we had talked to some officials in different places to figure out what are the key areas. Now, what was fascinating is, we studied, we were there for probably about an hour per location, and then we sort of looked at, okay, if you actually just multiply that by eight to 10 for the full day, what we found was there was 32,000 violations per day across just these 13 intersections, and about 76% of people were just not stopping. And this is actually quite similar to what we saw in Maryland initially. Very similar numbers, and um, it kind of is an interesting thing because if you put an officer there, people will come to a complete stop and it looks like the problem is solved. And it's sort of what's going on when the officer's not there that this really highlights. Um, and then, we're looking at crosswalk violations as well, which is if there's a crosswalk, you have a pedestrian crossing across or trying to cross, how often is a car coming to a stop as they should according to statute? And 3 out of 5 times when people were crossing, the car just blew through the crosswalk. And I think a lot of us here probably have experiences with that. But again, this really quantifies it and shows what drivers are doing. And it's not to blame the driver, right? It's not, maybe they were looking at their phone, maybe it was um, just being absent-minded. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is create a culture of safety where people are more conscientious when they drive. And how do we bring technology to be able to support that, especially when we don't have enough officer presence? And then, this is not a problem that is unique to Rhode Island. There's been a lot of traffic fatalities and crashes over the years, but this is actually something that people all across the country are facing. We're talking to cities and legislators and residents across the entire country, and the theme has just been consistent. Um, People don't feel safe on the roads. Now, just a quick snapshot of our technology. This is an example that we've deployed as a stop sign camera. A couple things to call out. It's solar powered, so very easy to install. Less than a week in most places. And what you see here is there's a uh, AI box here, which is, a device that's processing all the footage that's coming into the camera, and based on that, it's making determinations, is this a violation or not? Now, if it's a violation, it gets uploaded to be processed. If not, it can actually be destroyed on the device itself. And so you sort of protect privacy for folks who aren't committing violations. Um, and then finally, we make these brightly colored. They're not meant to be gotchas. They're not meant to be something that people don't see. Is actually, the same way when an officer is very present, you see people driving better. And that's what we're trying to do with these as well. Um, just to give you an example of our technology, this is what the camera is seeing. So it's making sense of the entire roadway. It can figure out what's cars, what's a dog, what's a person, in which direction people are traveling, how fast they're traveling. That means it can also detect things like stop signs and red lights. And so essentially what a human can see and make determinations on, the camera can as well. And so while we're really focusing on traffic enforcement, this allows the device to also give a lot of analytics on how many pedestrians go through here, how many bicycles are going through here. Um, and the way it can detect violations is from the same exact camera. It can tell you, is it skipping a stop sign? Is it speeding? This is an example of how the crosswalk violation detection works. You can not only see when cars aren't stopping, but the device itself can actually blur the pedestrian before the video leaves the device. And so you get to protect the privacy of these individuals while still keeping track of what the driver behavior looks like. Um, and then on top of that, sorry, was there a question?
Oh no, I'm just answering the questions in the chat.
Oh, okay.
I'll let you know. I'll ping you if there's something.
Thank you.
But I
Um,
mean, yeah, go ahead.
Um, on top of that, we do community support. What we find is in order to have um, a culture of safety created across the community, it's not about putting up these cameras and serving as a gotcha. It's actually about getting them involved from the beginning. And so before we work with any municipality and install anything, we actually do a widespread campaign. It's called the Let's Drive Safer program. We put up a transparency portal where people can actually just see the stats of their community directly. And then we really emphasize sort of this culture of regular education and using this revenue to actually pay for um, public improvements, whether it's speed bumps or parks or painting crosswalks. That's sort of how you make a program that gets a lot of buy-in. And I'll quickly kind of walk through the experience we had in Maryland, which is, we talked to some police chiefs there. They mentioned, running stop signs were sort of like the number one thing that they're getting complaints about. People are truly getting hurt. And similar to what we did in Rhode Island, we went and measured just how many violations were happening. And across just 12 municipalities, this was about 4 intersections per municipality, we were seeing 27,000 violations. And when we showed some of these numbers and the citizen feedback and testimony to lawmakers, they very quickly, within one session, passed that bill that we talked about at the beginning around stop sign camera enforcement. And what's been remarkable to see is the the amount of impact that we've had. Within just 4 or 5 months of the programs being live, we saw a 65% reduction in violations. And our program is fully cost neutral. It's paid for by the violations that come in. And so when we accounted for the cost, there's additional money that went back to the municipality. And again, across these first 6 months, $1.6 million were generated across the first 7 towns, with all the proceeds going towards public safety and public infrastructure projects. And so really special to be able to see that kind of impact in just 6 months, right? You've saved officer time, you've had a huge public safety improvement, and the municipalities have in revenue. Um, and on top of this, we were able to make sure that this is something that doesn't lead to a massive revolt by the community by really focusing on education and buy-in. And we actually saw close to 96% of people in some of these municipalities really supportive of the program because they noticed, hey, when my kids are getting off at the school bus and crossing the street to go home, it feels remarkably safer because a lot of people are actually stopping at these stop signs. Just to highlight a little bit on Rhode Island, so there's legislation that's been being drafted, focus on, again, using cameras, extending the speed camera legislation to be able to do stop sign running detection and not yielding to pedestrians. The focus is on school zones. It's sort of the place where the most vulnerable pedestrians are. um, the way that we have the business model and a lot of vendors in the space have the same business model is that it's cost neutral. So the vendor is in charge of installing the cameras, doing the first ticketing, mailing, and as the revenue comes in, it allows for the citation revenue to pay for the program and then some. And our vision and our goal is how do we make this as easy for municipalities to go forward with? They don't have to worry about finding grants or budgets. If the whole thing is essentially free to get started, it makes it a lot easier. And then finally, in the legislation itself, we do really focus on privacy and working on protecting the privacy before it's uploaded to any sort of cloud-based system. Um, and then lastly, as I mentioned, we do traffic studies. We've done this broader one in Rhode Island that I talked about at the beginning. Um, but we have a very lightweight process that we can do that's more deeper for specific municipalities. And again, this is how we help create that transparency portal that people can talk to their council members about, people can talk to their mayors about, and anywhere from a day to a week, we can go do these studies. And these are all free of charge. We have a operations team that's sort of constantly going out and collecting data just to figure out, how bad is the problem really. And so for any municipality that's interested, they're welcome to to raise their hand or get in touch, and we can walk you through the pilot program in a little bit more detail. Um, and generally, our goal is on one hand, let's get more informed. The program is Let's Drive Safer, and so we think part of the starting point is really getting the data to understand, how bad is the problem in our neighborhoods, and then from there on we can figure out what is the right solution. Is it an automated enforcement product? Is it just more data and directing officers to the right place? There's a lot of different ways that technology can be used. Um, So just to give you a little bit more detail on the Rhode Island specific legislation, we have a representative and senator who have a copy of the bill that they're introduced this month. And again, our focus is stop sign running and crosswalk, not yielding to pedestrians in school zones as well. And so, part of this conversation is letting you all know, hey, this is going to be introduced. This is going to be moving. And if there's municipalities and cities that are interested in learning more, supporting the legislation, there's of course always hearings and testimony that can help drive support for this. And then that tends to be the first group of municipalities that we work with to deploy this technology. And so if all things go according to plan, there's there's a chance that people can start having these cameras implemented in their communities by late summer, and actually have the impact that we talked about before the end of the year. So really, really meaningful win that can happen in a very short amount of time. Um, and so, that covers the basics of the slides. As a reminder, this helps you kind of focus on pedestrian safety. You see the results quickly, builds a culture of safety, and again, there's no cost that would come out of your budget. And so, I know went through a lot of content pretty quickly, but would love to hear from folks on, any questions that came to mind, but also just getting a better understanding of the traffic safety problems that people are dealing with in their communities. And maybe just before we turn it over, Seth, let me know if there's anything I missed or anything we should add.
No, I think there was a couple of questions. There was one question from Newport. Colin Kennedy is a city manager, is a big fan of AI tools, and he was saying that hopefully that this could evolve into a system that would help deal with overweight vehicles. And I said, our focus is initially on these safety use cases in the most vulnerable populations, but that's a use case that's on the product roadmap for the future. I used to be a town manager, and I remember how tracking overweight permits is very challenging.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I thank you for highlighting that. I don't want to take away from the more pressing safety matters that you're clearly addressing, which we appreciate. But in my community, especially in the era of Waze and other GPS features that are redirecting a lot of traffic off of main roads for a variety of reasons, they're ending up on some weight restricted streets, and there's virtually no way to effectively police that with the resources we have. So I'm dying for some technology to help with that. And I know the traffic safety AI marketplace is considering it. I'm literally waiting for the first firm that can make me a good sales pitch, and I'll be ready to get excited about it. So I'm glad that you're considering it. Hey, while I have the floor, I don't mean to. Um, I'm pleased to see the legislation is being considered at the state level. I'm glad it will help all of you out. This reminds me of a discussion I had with the League of Cities and Towns recently at an executive board meeting, where I talked about existing legislation for school zone speed cameras, which many communities are using. But it was enacted at a time when there were a lot more Big Brother concerns. And the result of that was that each approach to a speed zone required 4 big 12 square foot signs, which becomes a bit of an eyesore in a neighborhood. And so I'm hoping that same legislation or perhaps parallel legislation can also address perhaps relaxing that requirement, because I think as these systems become more and more accepted and ubiquitous, some of those obsessive sign requirements need to go the way of the dodo bird.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we certainly believe in being visible and letting people know things are there. I think maybe four massive signs around an intersection might be a little bit overkill, but we certainly support at least some signage, leading up to an intersection. And again, we also decorate our poles very brightly so that it's very obvious, but maybe a little bit less of an eyesore. Um,
Yeah, no, that's right.
But I
It's
I think
I don't mind signs. I don't, but it's four per approach. So on an intersection with a speed camera, you could theoretically have 16 signs jammed into an area. It's absurd. So
I think the
yeah.
other I think, Colin, the other thing to really note right now is that legislation was considering an older technology. What Drew is talking about here is blurring images of people in the crosswalk so that it never is actually recorded, which should mitigate a lot of those concerns that they were trying to deal with via the multiple signs. So I think you have a different system that the legislature is going to be looking at all together.
the
Excellent
other
point.
The other thing I was going to highlight is to the point on the trucks. So one thing that we do is we can actually classify the different kinds of vehicles. And so while the devices, the legislation is geared towards these different kinds of behaviors for enforcement, the same camera can actually be monitoring and telling you how many SUVs, how many trucks, box trucks, and even DoorDash drivers are going through a specific area. And um, that data could be used to help inform, overweight vehicle legislation in the future. If you end up having a um, desire based on the data, you can be able to show, look, there were 70% of pe people on these roads were trucks that weren't supposed to be here. And now you have a way to go back to legislation and say, look, we should be able to use cameras to enforce this.
I mean, quite frankly, look, as a former town manager, this gives you the ability to have data to advance a complete streets program, to advance like a safe streets program, whatever policies that you're looking to institute on the roadway, all of a sudden you have data to back those positions up without bringing in new third parties or spending staff time. What other questions can we address? Anything? Any comments or feedback on whether you think this is responsive to needs in your community?
I'd definitely love to hear from some of our law enforcement to see their reactions.
Well, since you don't want to hear more from me, but I'll just point out you mentioned some of the legislation is looking into stop sign enforcement. I think I just heard the other day from one of my city councilors about what can we do about this one stop sign that everybody is not just rolling through but running through. And at the time I said, well, that's really tough to do without direct enforcement. And lo and behold, the very next day I'm in a workshop Wednesday, and there's a firm talking about a technological potential solution to that. So bravo. I think that would be a real plus.
Glad to hear it. Good timing on our part, right, Colin?
Yeah, it's like you planned it that way, Jen. Well done.
I'm
Nice.
psychic in my spare time. Oh.
Yeah, and saw your comment, Andy. Certainly, I think the legislation has a lot of potential here. Again, it was able to pass within just one session in Maryland, and Virginia, the same bill just passed the House on Monday. And so I do think more and more people are receptive to it. And I think if legislators hear that, public safety, police departments would actually use this, it also gives them a few more kind of talking points as they make their way through hearings.
Terrific.
I guess, one question for you all is curious how you think some of your communities would respond to it. From what I've heard, the school zone speed cameras in Rhode Island have been incredibly successful. Curious if you all think in your communities this is something that you'd find effective, and then two, if you think your communities would be receptive.
I mean, I can only speak for Newport, but it's very much neighborhood to neighborhood here. We tried to we depending on who you ask, it seems like we misread some council guidance about a year ago and worked on putting a speed zone camera in a neighborhood that we thought had a dire need for it. But then there was a political revolt. I don't think it was an actual. I think the majority of constituents would have still wanted it, but some of the politics got in the way, and we ended up removing it. Whereas we have an underprivileged portion of our community in the north end of our city, which seems very welcoming and accepting of this type of technology, in particular because that's where our elementary school is. So yeah, I think it is. I think at least I can only speak for Newport, but I have a sense that this is probably common in the state. It is very much a neighborhood to neighborhood issue. I don't think you can even break it down municipality to municipality.
I would echo that. South Kingstown, we haven't even adopted speed cameras, but I think there's not a lot of politicians on the line, apparently, because we're all reserved because in administration, I think the data speaks for itself, and you can make that argument. But there's a whole political end to this, neighborhood to neighborhood, that you have to fight this out of. Does the data support? And it's also the climate. If there's somebody struck near a school zone, that climate has changed and makes it more amenable to community acceptance. And the councils, which many of us work for, or local legislator, it's really their will, and they have to deal with the community. So I think the reason we're not chiming in probably is, while we may agree with the data and what you're showing us, the cameras in general are a touchy issue. The speed cameras are still not fully vetted in every community. In addition, flock cameras are a big point of discussion, and that changes. After the Brown shooting, there was a whole discussion on that. So I think you're touching new waters here, especially with AI. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes. I think the biggest thing for you would be, you have some really great data points, the heat maps, showing those trends on what it can do for safety. And I think that those are the cases that you need to make one community at a time.
No, I really appreciate that feedback. I think as we started Obvio and started to talk to people across the country, we heard that exact thing, day in, day out, which is, do communities really want this? Is this something where, there's a lot of practicalities to it that make sense, the data, the cost benefit analysis, but ultimately, are people comfortable with it? And we, frankly, before we started this company, thought that community concerns and privacy would be the number one challenge to getting this adopted, even though it's such a no-brainer when you look at the impact. And so there's certainly pushback that we've received from certain communities. I'm not going to pretend that's not true. But there's a couple things that have been really interesting, just food for thought for y'all to think about. One is um, we sort of looked at, what are the reasons why community members are nervous about these? Like, why are they frustrated? And there were sort of two feedbacks that we received almost constantly. One was, hey, this doesn't feel like a transparent thing. It just feels like people are putting up these cameras and generating revenue, and I don't even know if it's impactful. And one of the things that I mentioned is we, before we go into any community and deploy anything, we do these free traffic studies where, for people's specific roadways, we can put together this portal and show people, hey, in your community, this is the number of violations that we're getting. This is you can go through any community and people can see the videos themselves. And I think a lot of people in the communities, when they see these videos, you just see heads nodding. People start smiling, people start gasping, because there's a few people where, it's a problem that they've known about forever and they've been complaining, and finally someone's giving visibility to it. There's another where people sort of look at themselves and say, okay, I am doing that. Like, I get why that's a problem. The second thing is, in our program, we actually also do, if you get a citation, we start with warning periods, we start with warning letters. Once you get a citation, you actually can go to a website to watch your own behavior. It's not this just like, take it in the mail, you pay, you actually watch and see what you did. And so there's just this big educational component about this that has helped, in the communities that we've been working with. I think the third thing that's sort of a really interesting uh, kind of finding, and I'll share this article in Bloomberg that basically did uh, they did a piece that was sort of looking at the perception of automated traffic enforcement, whether people like think it's a good idea or not. And it actually is fascinating because it kind of breaks down in various communities using um, these technologies that you will always have a couple of these loud voices, the kinds of people that might show up to city council and sort of say like, hey, this is overreach. But in the vast majority of communities, when you look at the polling, more than 80% of people are actually really supportive of these technologies. It's just not the most popular thing for someone to go out and say, I want more speed cameras around. So they tend to be a little bit more quiet. And this is certainly mirrored what we've seen in these communities where anytime we do a traffic study, sometimes we're on the roadways we're with cameras. Anytime someone asks us, what are we doing? And we say, oh, we're just doing a traffic study. We're trying to help reduce stop sign running. We just constantly hear from people like, oh, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad that you're doing this. And so, we certainly see it as for any municipality that thinks that they're even slightly interested, we certainly see our jobs to help introduce it to the community because this program is only successful if the community changes behavior. And so that's certainly part of the whole approach. And the last thing I'll say is over time, when we look at the number of people who are receiving citations, usually about 90% of people who receive citations are the ones who are not from the community. They're the people cutting through, whether it's, the commercial truck drivers, FedEx, but also just people in a hurry and using towns as cut-throughs. And I think a lot of communities that we work with have seen those stats, have seen that, and sort of realized, yeah, we need this because, the people who are cutting through our towns aren't the ones who care about our kids in our schools. Um, so certainly, certainly hear the concerns that you raise, Lucas. But I think, if you use sort of like a modern community-friendly approach and don't rush into it, you can see acceptance in a way that I think would surprise a lot of people.
Great. Any other questions, comments? All right. Well, certainly I would love to thank our colleagues from Obvio and their representatives as well for introducing the technology and allowing us to have a good discussion about, community by community and neighborhood by neighborhood, how these new technologies are impacting us. Um, I will certainly circulate the information again and the slides too, if you are willing to share those, Drew. And we have recorded the session as well, which will be on our YouTube channel later on this afternoon. So please feel free to share with colleagues who may not have been able to join us. So on behalf of the league, thank you all for coming.
And if you have
Oh,
follow-up
sorry.
questions, our contact information will be there. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jim.
You.